The strongest argument for priority in the Synoptic Gospels is also the only one that's dispositive. That is, every ancient source that discusses the order of the Synoptic Gospels places Matthew first. Using universally accepted source and historical critical methods in any other context, this particular fact would be established as certain as is possible with any historical analysis. But yet there is consensus, unanimity, among biblical scholars that it's not Matthew, but rather Mark that was the first synoptic gospel written. This is despite total silence on this point in the historical record. Yes, not a single ancient historian or skeptic argued for Mark being first. No ancient sources ever debated this. In short, this Markan priority position is taken in the total and complete absence of any extrinsic evidence supporting it. Just let that sink in for a bit. What other scholarly field could get away with such outlandish and unchecked unanimity? At best, it's embarrassingly poor scholarship. At worst, there's a separate, not so unspoken agenda. So let's solve this case. But before we get too far, let's set the stage up front for the rest of this analysis. And it's pretty basic. If the ancient sources are correct, if even one credible proximal source is correct, then Matthew is the first of the synoptic gospels written, full stop. And Mark, logically and historically, cannot be first. This point is critical, so it's worth repeating. If the historical accounts testifying to canonical Matthew as the first of the canonical gospels to be written are not false, then Mark cannot be argued in any intellectually honest or logically coherent manner to have been first. This is not an opinion, it's not a matter of one's preference, it's an inescapable, undeniable truth. This is because of the following 2 points. First, the surviving intrinsic Markan priority arguments, namely the debunked arguments from order, editorial fatigue, and Mark's redaction profile if he was last, all fail decisively to justify displacing Matthew. At the very best, if not outright favoring Matthew as first, all such intrinsic arguments equally favor Matthew and Mark as first. Second, there is no ancient testimony or any historical evidence for Mark being first, including no shred of evidence of debate on this issue, competing theory, or the like. If you're still unsure about either of these, especially the rebuttals to the intrinsic arguments for Mark, please see my earlier videos linked in the description. So as we conduct our analysis, what is it we must find here to maintain even a modicum of viability for the feeble, debased position of Markan priority? Answer: we must be able to show decisively that every tradition placing canonical Matthew ahead of Mark is erroneous. Each and every ancient historian who offered such testimony with geographical and temporal diversity must be wrong. But how do most modern scholars approach this task? They can be divided into one of 3 broad camps. Camp 1, they outright ignore the evidence. Yep, they just say na 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 boo boo. Most biblical scholars are in this bucket. The second camp acknowledges it, but argues that the intrinsic case for Mark trumps. A fair but incoherent position which I've examined in detail previously. The third camp comprises the distinct minority of scholars that make an actual effort to challenge the evidence on the merits, only to discredit the data with a bunch of half-baked rebuttals. This is by far the smallest group. We can't do anything about the first camp. That's essentially the sine qua non of biblical scholarship. Cherry pick what you like and ignore the rest. As for Camp 2, I've addressed why the intrinsic arguments fail hard for Markan priority in earlier videos. Seriously, go watch them. So that leaves us with the third camp, and here, again, there are several broad buckets their arguments fall into. The arguments trying to do this come in a variety of forms, and we'll examine each in detail over the span of 2 videos. In no particular order, we have 1. Any reference to a Hebrew Matthew and priority of such material is distinct from the canonical Greek Matthew, i.e., who cares? 2. Every reference to a Hebrew Matthew is traced to Papias, and Papias' surviving testimony is unreliable. 3. The current canonical Greek Matthew could not have been a translation of any prior Semitic, Hebrew, or Aramaic text, even if one entertains that there ever was a Hebrew Matthew, as it shows no sign of being a translation. 4. No copies of any Hebrew Matthew are extant. 5. There is some bias in the ancient record that felt a need to fabricate authority in order to connect apostolicity to the Gospels. 6. Papias' otherwise unreliable testimony can be argued to place Mark ahead of Matthew, since Mark's origin is discussed before Matthew's. Before we get too far, a word about authorship of the Gospels. There's simply no way to cover this topic without spending some time on the overlapping issue of who wrote the Gospels and to a lesser extent when they were written. Because that's a massive subject in and of itself, also shamelessly botched by the Religious Studies Academy, I'll do my best to avoid making assumptions in that area for now that might bias this analysis. For the sake of this discussion, we'll go ahead and accept the traditional gospel attributions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as representing the authors of those respective gospels unless stated otherwise. There are two early and clear sources on the priority of Matthew that date from the latter part of the 2nd century. One is Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote no later than 180 AD, and the other is Clement of Alexandria, who perhaps wrote contemporaneously. As we'll discuss, both testify that Matthew was the first of the canonical Gospels to be written, and neither relies on Papias, whom we'll discuss later for this priority issue, as what survives of Papias is silent on the issue of priority. In the most conservative posture, Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria represent three distinct lines of tradition on the issue of priority. Irenaeus representing his own distinct line, and Clement representing both his own personal knowledge as a distinct line and the tradition of the presbyters as a separate line. Note, this is a conservative view. As we'll discuss, it's wacky and historically infeasible to argue that either of these men created their own tradition from thin air or got their tradition from a single solitary source. As we'll see, they were operating in a burgeoning Christian empire with myriad practitioners, traditions, skeptics, heretics, eyewitnesses, etc. We'll start with the records of Irenaeus, who writes,
"We have learned from none others the plan of our salvation, than from those through whom the gospel has come down to us, which they did at one time proclaim in public, and, at a later period, by the will of God, handed down to us in the Scriptures, to be the ground and pillar of our faith. For, after our Lord rose from the dead, the apostles were invested with power from on high when the Holy Spirit came down upon them, and had perfect knowledge. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia."
There are three key takeaways from this testimony. 1. Matthew was first, and he issued a gospel amongst the Hebrews in their own dialect. We'll return to what that means later. 2nd, Matthew issued his gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome. For now, we're not looking at this for issues of dating, rather just for setting the temporal relationship between Matthew and the other gospels. And 3rd, after Peter and Paul died, Mark handed down his gospel. While it isn't clear whether Luke or Matthew came second, it's crystal clear from this evidence that Irenaeus placed Matthew's gospel as first in time. It's essential to understand the context in which Irenaeus is writing. Irenaeus, originally from Smyrna in modern-day Turkey, is a bishop of a church in Lyon, France. That means by the time he's writing, and undoubtedly much earlier, there were multiple organized ecclesiastical bodies, not just of leaders, but of followers and believers in Christ. For instance, Clement is writing from Alexandria, nearly 1,700 miles south of Lyon. Within this body, there were countless sources of tradition, many claiming to trace their ancestry to apostolic authority. Against this backdrop, there were competing traditions, which today, as well as then, were referred to as heretical. While this is important for the issue of authorship, which I'll examine in a later video, it's just as important for the issue of gospel priority. Though it's impossible to know the numbers with precision, estimates range from around 40,000 Christians globally in AD 150, all the way to 1.17 million by AD 250. At the time of Irenaeus, there may have been nearly 200,000 Christians or more globally. This is more than fertile enough soil for some competing traditions to develop, and indeed they did on other issues, just never, even once, on the issue of priority. Instead, we have a robust amount of evidence buttressing the credibility of the testimony that we get from Irenaeus. Here are some examples from Irenaeus' testimony.
But, again, when we refer them to that tradition which originates from the apostles, and which is preserved by means of the succession of presbyters in the churches, they object to tradition, saying that they themselves are wiser not merely than the presbyters, but even than the apostles, because they have discovered the unadulterated truth.
Here, Irenaeus is referring broadly to tradition which originates from the apostles and is preserved by the church elders. For our analysis thus far, we've presumed for the sake of argument that Irenaeus is the sole source for his tradition, or, as we'll discuss later, that he relied solely on Papias. But the point here is that between the two propositions, where one is that Irenaeus is only relying on a single source for his information, and the other that Irenaeus is drawing his testimony from a broad tradition of multiple sources, the former conflicts with the preserved testimony. And it strains credulity and common sense to argue for a single source in such an environment, even without this supporting testimony. Irenaeus again.
It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church, who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. And we are in a position to reckon up those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and, to demonstrate, the succession of these men to our own times, those who neither taught nor knew of anything like what these heretics rave about.
Again, a global set of multiple churches, many claiming traditions handed down by the apostles and preserved by the elders and bishops. Multiple geographically dispersed people with a vested interest in preserving sacred traditions, yet none of them ever debates these points on priority. More significantly, Irenaeus cites unbroken apostolic connections through direct connection to the relevant church elders or presbyters who themselves tie claims to the apostles. For example, there is Polycarp. Here are some relevant excerpts concerning that connection.
But Polycarp also was not only instructed by apostles, and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but was also, by apostles in Asia, appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna, whom I also saw in my early youth, for he tarried, on earth, a very long time, and, when a very old man, gloriously and most nobly suffering martyrdom, departed this life, having always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles, and which the church has handed down, and which alone are true. To these things all the Asiatic churches testify, as do also those men who have succeeded Polycarp down to the present time, a man who was of much greater weight, and a more steadfast witness of truth, than Valentinus, and Marcion, and the rest of the heretics.
And we have ample testimony that Polycarp, who Irenaeus claims to have heard in his youth, was linked to the Apostle John.
For I have a more vivid recollection of what occurred at that time than of recent events, inasmuch as the experiences of childhood, keeping pace with the growth of the soul, become incorporated with it, so that I can even describe the place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit and discourse, his going out, too, and his coming in, his general mode of life and personal appearance, together with the discourses which he delivered to the people. Also how he would speak of his familiar intercourse with John, and with the rest of those who had seen the Lord, and how he would call their words to remembrance.
And Irenaeus tells us that John passed down his traditions to, at least, the church in Ephesus, also in modern-day Turkey, from where Irenaeus originates.
Then, again, the church in Ephesus, founded by Paul, and having John remaining among them permanently until the times of Trajan, is a true witness of the tradition of the apostles.
So let's summarize. Irenaeus was a bishop of a growing church in modern-day France. He was born in modern-day Turkey, where large churches, such as those at Ephesus and Smyrna, reside. In his younger days, he reports hearing the teachings of Polycarp firsthand, and Polycarp testified to getting his teachings from John and others who had seen Jesus. Multiple geographically diverse churches attest to preserving the teachings from the apostles and other witnesses to Jesus through their bishops and elders. So is the argument that Irenaeus just dishonestly fabricated his entire testimony out of whole cloth? After all, this is apologetic work, and so he must have had an agenda, right? Because to disregard his testimony here, we'd have to believe that either 1, he lied, 2, he was confused, or 3, he was misled by Papias and all of the other sources of tradition. Let's write off the proposition that he lied and made his claims up from thin air. If that's your position, then it's one taken without a lick of evidence and thus deserves no further analysis. Let's also set aside the notion that he was misled by Papias. We'll get to that in part 2. But for now, suffice it to say that Papias alone could not have been the sole source for that priority position, at least not based on the evidence that we have. So was Irenaeus confused? Well, his statements couldn't have taken place in a vacuum. In ancient times, when texts like Against Heresies were written, they were copied and distributed. There would have been living people who could debate and contest the accounts. If he was confused, misremembering, etc., where is the debate? Where is the record of opponents taking him to task? It's simply not there. Again, to believe he was wrong, we'd have to believe that Irenaeus single-handedly made up this claim and that 200,000 people just accepted it because up to this point, not one of them had a competing answer or opinion on some of these most basic of questions, such as who wrote these and when? For over 100 years, these people just blindly plodded along, never asking, never answering these basic questions. Again, you can believe that if you choose, but it fails abductively, and so we can't spend any more time on that here. Not when there are far better explanations for the evidence, such as Irenaeus was merely reporting the tradition he had learned, honestly and faithfully, from multiple sources. And this is not an argument from silence. An argument from silence does not occur when there are zero sources for something. The fallacy of silence occurs when one source mentions something, but then it's presumed to be untrue when that thing is not found in other sources. That's not what we have here. We do not have a single source saying anything other than what Irenaeus does. In fact, as we'll see, we have multiple sources corroborating Irenaeus. With that said, let's re-summarize and examine Irenaeus' testimony. It's fairly straightforward. Matthew issued a written gospel amongst the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were still preaching in Rome. After they died, Mark and Luke respectively issued gospels of their preachings, and John, a disciple of Jesus, issued the fourth and last of the canonical gospels. To be clear, the purpose of this statement was not to argue any specific chronology of the gospels, nor does it relate in any way to what we call the modern synoptic problem. Rather, this was a matter-of-fact inclusion into a larger apologetic work by Irenaeus in responding to heretics. Notably, this testimony is written to challenge those who offer competing heretical teachings. Yet this statement on priority is offered without defense or argument, as if it was already well accepted. Nothing here indicates that Irenaeus cared at all about which gospel was first, nor did it appear that his opponents did either. This disinterested, agendaless point of view strengthens the value of this evidence. Note especially that Irenaeus cites apostolic, including Paul, authority for all four divinely inspired gospels, with no indication that attribution to Mark and Luke in any way diminished their quote-unquote perfect status. He reveals no biased agenda whatsoever to place Mark after Matthew, given his view of the perfect apostolic, divinely inspired nature of each gospel. Again, to flog this issue one more time, there is no record that the order he provides, Matthew, then Mark and Luke, then John, was being challenged or ever challenged. Irenaeus does not specify which of Mark or Luke was earlier, but he is clear that Matthew was first and John was last. Additionally, and crucially, it is uncontested that by the time Irenaeus was writing, all four canonical Greek Gospels were widely known and in circulation, and thus it is clear that whatever one thinks about an original Hebrew Matthew, and we'll cover that topic in part 2, Irenaeus is arguing that it's the canonical Greek Matthew through this Hebrew predecessor that came first. In short, Irenaeus is drawing no distinction between canonical Matthew, known in his time to exist in Greek, and its Hebrew predecessor. There is no evidence that Irenaeus possessed or ever saw a Hebrew Matthew. In other words, whatever one thinks about a Hebrew Matthew predecessor, Irenaeus is arguing that the Greek canonical Matthew he knew and he was familiar with is the one that came first. As we shall see with Papias, this Hebrew original was likely immediately translated into Greek by multiple parties. Before we turn to our next source, I want to underline something that should be obvious to biblical scholars based on their own core methodologies, yet it's something which they inexplicably seem to miss or worse, intentionally ignore. That is, in the absence of conflict on this issue, we don't need any other extrinsic sources besides Irenaeus to establish Matthean priority. We've touched on this a bit, but I want to plant that seed right away. Irenaeus represents a line of testimony on priority that's both dependent and independent of Papias, as Papias never comments on priority. His testimony is influenced by elders with first-hand knowledge of the early development of the church, including those with apostolic ties such as Polycarp. While he is removed from eyewitnesses to Jesus, he was in a position to have reliable knowledge with those who would have been around the first generation of written gospels. Note that for the issue of priority, we're not per se committed to going back to actual eyewitnesses to Jesus. We have those and we'll address them in other videos, but for our present purposes, it's these first generation Christians who came immediately after the apostles that we care about, as they are just as reliable on the issue of priority as eyewitnesses to Jesus. Unless we have a compelling basis to believe that all of this testimony from Irenaeus is either wrong or unreliable, the priority debate is over and Matthew is first. While fragments of Irenaeus' work survive, unfortunately everything we know about Clement of Alexandria on this subject comes from the compilations of Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in roughly 313 AD. Here's what Clement says as recounted by Eusebius.
Again in the same books, Clement has placed a tradition of the presbyters from the beginning regarding the order of the Gospels, which goes like this. He said that the Gospels which contained the genealogies were written first, but that the Gospel according to Mark had this occasion. When Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome, and by the Spirit proclaimed the Gospel, those present, who were numerous, urged Mark, inasmuch as he had followed him for a long time and remembered what had been spoken, to write down what was said. And after he had done this he gave it out to those who requested it. When Peter discovered this, he neither energetically prevented it nor urged it on. But John, the last, being conscious that external facts had been exhibited in the Gospels, on the urging of his disciples and inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel. This is the account of Clement.
Again, Matthew and Luke, the Gospels with the genealogies, come ahead of Mark. Clement does not say which is first between these two, but he is clear that both precede Mark and that John is last. There are a few notable things about Clement. First, he claims to be referencing the tradition of the presbyters or elders. Thus, this is an explicitly different line of tradition than that of Papias, who is not mentioned as a source, and it's also distinct from Irenaeus, also not mentioned. Second, to add to the distinct nature of the tradition here, we get additional different facts, such as the extra details we get about Mark and John. And Clement places the Gospels with the genealogies first. This differs slightly from Irenaeus, which is evidence again that Clement isn't merely drawing his tradition from Papias or Irenaeus. Even if we went with the lazy argument that Clement got his info about Mark being an interpreter of Peter from Papias, the fact that Clement differs on these other details, never mentions Papias, and states that he got his information from primitive authorities all reinforce at the very least an additional separate line of tradition from Papias. This strengthens the case that Matthew came before Mark, complementing the testimony of Irenaeus without contradicting any of Irenaeus' testimony on priority. In any other context, when added to Irenaeus' testimony, this would be ironclad, especially when we consider that Clement's documents are being written, copied, and distributed in a church that is 1,700 miles away. But again, traditional scholars are either being intellectually dishonest or they're unfamiliar with the source material, and either is shameful. So this leaves us with Papias as it relates to the earliest evidence on priority. But before turning to Papias, there's one other critical detail to note. Clement says nothing about a version of Matthew written in Hebrew. Again, not only does this strengthen the argument for a unique, corroborating line of tradition of Matthew coming ahead of Mark, but it also eliminates one of the major counter-arguments to Papias, and thus Irenaeus by proxy, which is the dubious claim that Matthew never was, or never could have been, an originally Hebrew gospel. We'll cover that in part 2. Since Clement's surviving evidence doesn't make this claim about a Hebrew Matthew, and importantly doesn't contradict it either, Clement alone, like Irenaeus, carries all the water that's needed. But put together with Irenaeus, and it's hard to imagine a more definitive, open-shut historical case than this one. Only a not-so-unspoken agenda can explain the incredibly suspect and intellectually dishonest rejection of this evidence. So, we're left only with the arguments pertaining to Papias and those criticizing the notion of a prior Hebrew Matthew. As stated, we'll cover those in the next video. But to be clear, you could stop here and have assurance you've gotten the critical aspects of the extrinsic, patristic arguments favoring Matthean priority. And we'll close this video with a summary of why. First, Clement doesn't mention a Hebrew Matthew. Second, Clement, at a minimum, represents a line of tradition distinct from Hebrew Matthew. Third, Clement also represents tradition that's distinct from Papias, as there is no evidence he relied on Papias, further supported by the differences between Clement and Irenaeus. 4. Alone, Irenaeus and Clement are strong in favor of Matthew. 5. Combined, they make Matthean priority ironclad because they are two sources, and 6. Each addresses the so-called criticisms against the other. Truly, in any other historical analysis or in any other historical field, this would be more than enough to definitively settle the very simple question of which of the Synoptic Gospels came first. And for over 1,700 years, this was in fact the case. Still, we'll cover the remaining arguments in the final section, part 2 of this analysis, so stay tuned.